Hello once again everyone, and welcome to the final part of the Fiore's armored spear, or lance. And as you may have noticed, today I am being nice to myself and I'm not in my full armor. That's because we've got a lot of different things to talk about, and I will need my breath. So if anyone wants to get in Jake, or is it a time for the final time? Well, not like ominous final. I'll put you in the closet again, we'll bring you back out next time we need to do something pasta. But either way. So this is my conclusions video that I've kind of been hinting at the entire time. What this is meant to talk about is the overarching why, right? Because compared to most, I'm not going to say most spear systems, because most spear systems are pretty diverse, but compared to what most people will end up doing with a spear, this is significantly more diverse and wide than one might be used to. So I want to talk about some of the other things you can do out of the spear, and another kind of consideration that you may want to have when it comes to approaching not just Fiore's system, but other spears, be they in armor or out of armor. So to start that off, the biggest thing I want to talk about is number one, when you take the spear point off of this just turns into a staff. So anything you know how to do with staff, and by extension anything you know how to do with a sword, is still absolutely present. Now that, however, can be extended in more ways than one. With the sword, of course, we're used to pretty much everything being out in front of us, but with staff, not only do the 8 directions of attack and just action, as well as high and low lines, play a lot more obviously, but also now I have a longer tool that can be literally altered in my hand at the drop of a hat and do more forming. So we're going to show a little bit of that, as well as perhaps some other possibilities as to how you could end up in some of these positions. So firstly, with the topic of what you can do with a stick, let's start looking at some of our postas on the right and left side, and how you could possibly end up in them, but not initially. So, Jake will once again be resuming everyone's favorite goof guard, right? Because guess what? This guy usually wins, right? But either way, how could I end up in a position like tutto portifero? That being either tip up or tip down. Now I could absolutely take it, but one of the things that I find happens quite a bit is if I was already playing right foot forward with my right hand on the spear, and he thrusts low at me, it can often be very nice for me to create a tonare backward as I parry with my lower half. Especially when you're dealing with armor, I can't afford to be reaching all that far down. I just sweep it across where he would be going for my hips to expulse it out the side. He, of course, is in a more stable position to just pull backward. Since he's not doing a passing step or even really a lunge at the moment, he's just kind of extending down, we now end up at proper measure that I can fold into tutto with the tip up. And from there, when he does his second thrust, I can do my action as I wish to do it. Alternatively, another action I could do, and this is the one, again, this is why I prefer my tutto to be tipped down, is I find myself fighting here more. If I am standing left foot forward and he thrusts down at my hip, then I can use that pivot movement that we've seen before. I end up basically into tutto portifero, he thrusts again. Now I can step forward with that parry as I execute my next technique and get a shot in on him. This one can be particularly nice because usually the first attack going for your hip, you're not going to see coming, right? I'm fighting and playing up here, all of a sudden it drops, right? He's not going to stay there, so he pulls back. And then the second one, I have a bit more inclination that it's coming and can step into it. Those are just two options that could take you there, and they really boil down to the same thing. Someone's thrusting on the lower line, so if you are right hand forward, you could absolutely still parry this way. But with our current setup, there is something I want to talk about. So when he thrusts, this parry is not nearly as strong as my other one. It's not that I can't still achieve it, and I just did, but if he's going for my hip, we'll line this up with the hip. This is me pushing against all of his strength. Unless I turn my hip into it when I do that parry, I don't have a very good chance of getting it clear. So when I am playing right hand forward, it is sometimes in my best interest to instead go ahead and not only bring my hip out of target, but to put that butt end forward, as this will give me a stronger parry without necessarily losing me anything, right? Since he's coming forward as well, getting my tip out of the way isn't the worst thing in the world. If we were to try and rush from this distance, I'm safe. Even if he had a shorter spear or things along those lines, I'm still pretty secure. But that folds me back into a tip up, weighted back position that can then come back in. Now, while we're on the subject of this first guard, let's also talk about the idea of breaking. So we did this out of Finestra last time, but breaking is when I'm going to create a hard overbind, basically striking with the staff, right? Now out of low tutto, you don't really get to do this, right? When he thrusts in, if I try to overbind, this is about all I get, right? It's still strong, don't get me wrong, but I'm not going to be able to break it down to the ground without putting my left foot forward, and that will be very bad for me. So, with tip up, on the other hand, it does give me the ability to put a lot more force down and get a much wider angle by adding a bit more strike to it, a bit more fendenti, and then from here I can place my point however I see fit. So something you can experiment with is choosing, after you do your parry, to either come back in with the exchange of points, or alternatively, to break the incoming spear thrust. And both are well worth practicing, because depending upon how fast he's thrusting, you may not have time to really set yourself to do a counter thrust. You may just need to go ahead and do a hard parry, which is basically all the breaking is. But either way, let's move on. Now the next position we end up in is mezzo porta di ferro, here. There are a couple different situations that could get us here, actually. And this, I will say, is one that you do see people hang out in a little bit more, because guess what? Fighting in armor is hard, and sometimes you want to take a breather, right? But some things to consider. Number one is going to be, if I can end up in this position, one of the things I do see happen a decent amount is the idea of I was playing right hand forward, and I attacked and got parried widely. And for whatever reason, I am unable to pull it back to me. So my tip is already down when he's looking to start his next thrust. The thing I can do to save myself a little bit of time is, since I know my spear is low, as he lets it go, I also go ahead and bring my body back. At this distance, Jake cannot get me, which means that he'll have to reassess before he comes in, which gives me that moment to go from I just stepped back to I'm really in the parry, where I can move from. Well, in the guard is what I meant. Posta is the word I was looking for. So here's that kind of idea again. I attack in and I get parried. I step back with it, and now I am able to execute either a breaking or my exchange of points, or just a parry and then riposte as I did with that movement, because I took that second to step back. Fiore has this tornare all the time, right? And it's a good idea to if you want to maintain range, because I do not want to end up in a close range game with him, especially in this situation. Let's look at that again. Now you could look at the counter as an option, right? So for example, I attack, he parries me. There's nothing saying that I couldn't step up for the butt strike, but with our current range, you know, because I should be able to do this against short or long spear, that's a long way for me to go. He will probably succeed even if I am in armor. It might be my better chance to go ahead and pull back and bake him into something better. Getting him to come to me is a lot simpler because my weapon is closer. But either way, it's just a consideration for you. Now, as for the motion itself, all it is once my spear gets parried, I just pretty much step back and I am in mezzo porta di ferro. I can refine it, of course, given that half second, but I can still absolutely do my motion from here. And if I'm in a bit more of a sloppy one, from there I can still break the point by just adding a little bit more lateral force. Now, I'm not swinging it pure sideways. I am still bringing it up and down, which gives me more of this almost kind of like hockey stick kind of angle. Once I get that broken, I now can cover this distance much faster than he can. So just another option for you. Now, we'll hold off on the finesters because I want to talk about them as one piece. The next position we'll start talking about is going to be moving over to the left side, wherein we're going to talk about dente de gingado. Now, the position you could end up going here is actually the same as we did with tutto porta di ferro, because these things are basically inverse of each other. I'm playing left hand forward, he thrusts at my hip. I choose to step back as I perform my parry. Same situation, and I do the same action. This side, however, you could still achieve the strong parry going across this way, but then it'll be kind of funky angles. It doesn't quite work the same way unless he chooses to thrust right back in, so I don't really favor it. But again, sort of the butt strike of the tornare does work out pretty well on this side. And I also find that, you know, since I'm playing left hand forward, this one's decently common. When he does this thrust in against me, I may need to do this. And also it can then fold into other positions. So if I wanted to fold into finesse or things along those lines, I kind of have the option of either stopping here or continuing to turn if I choose to. Now, when it comes to our last one, we've already kind of gone over that. Well, almost last one, second last one. When it comes to Veracroce, we've talked about the idea of Jake turning me. But I want to go, and I've shown that one, so if you want to see it in more detail, go ahead and look at the guards on the left side. But the other one I wanted to give a bit more detail on is the idea of me playing front and back, or a reciprocal guard. So, the idea here would be, I'm playing left hand forward, but I am not facing Jake. This is terrifying, right? I am not facing Jake as I'm fighting someone, but suddenly there is someone I need to concern myself with. as he comes in with his thrust, I use that tornare to escape. Now this one especially can do a lot more breaking if you want it to. Because essentially all I'm standing in is called a long guff with a long sword. The trick with it is going to depend upon how deep Jake gets when he comes in against me, and also how far back / to the side I am allowed to step. So what I mean by that is, if I am actually fighting someone here, I don't really want to step too much toward him when I turn around. My goal basically is once I look, I'm really more looking to get kind of this way as I step. But if there is no one that I fear, i.e., I was just turned, or alternatively, that person is, buggering off because they think their buddy's about to get me, when I look, I can put a lot more force into that and really break that spear point down. And all I need to do with that is just create a little bit more overbind as I do so. But these are all things you actually already know how to do, thanks to the sword section. Just I'm going back rather than in. Now for our final guard. The final guard I want to talk about is, of course, Fenestra, which they're the same on both sides. But the way you could get in there is a couple different options. The first one we talked about was the idea of parry, which certainly if you're having your dominant hand on the spear, he comes in with a shot, you may need to do on either side. You're playing left hand forward, you could still parry this way, but if he's cutting toward your opening, you may need to parry this way. Another option, however, can come from that same situation that I was just talking about, because there's a fun little line in there. That line being, when it comes to showing the left Fenestra, Fiore does say, if I do not strike you first, then I may do. Meaning, in theory, when he's standing with this left, he does thrust initially more. Now, he may still mean the exact same thing in the right Fenestra, but it is kind of an odd little throwaway line. What this got me thinking about was the idea of, again, those reciprocal guards, and in particular, the fastest transition from them. So if I was going to thrust with the spear initially as my beginning action, I would prefer for my dominant hand to be lined up in some way. I'm perfectly happy to play left foot forward, but if I'm going to do this, I'd really rather start from a place of strength, i.e., I'm already lined up the way I want to be. If I'm going to use any sort of extra outside force, then I'd like my right hand to be on it so that I'm using it more like the sword. So what situation could cause me to want to thrust first as a left-hander with a spear? And this is where I get the idea of turning. So if I'm playing left hand forward, in this case against Jake, right? And I suddenly need to turn and attack someone behind me, it is not necessarily out of the question for me to go ahead and just switch sides like this. You see that done all the time in various different things. But I may not be able to. Another option, however, would be for me to move into Fenestra as I turn over, allowing me then to thrust. The thing I also find with this particular transition is it usually puts my hands about where I want them to be for being able to execute that thrust quite quickly. So what that would look like is if I'm playing over here and someone tells me there's an opportunity behind me, I can turn and then create that thrust quite easily, and with a surprising amount of strength, even though his guard is up, because I have to turn and he does not. So here's that again. I turn, I've got my point on target. I can then come forward with strength, or alternatively, when I turn, I could also go ahead and throw a shot at him and see what happens from there. So I think that situation of needing to suddenly do a reciprocal guard, as we see multiple times, could also apply to the spear, and might be another reason that you could end up in this kind of odd left Fenestra, besides just blocking a strike, and also giving the opportunity to thrust initially. Now mind you, it should be noted, you can also just thrust like this without too much difficulty, even in your arm harness. It's just, you're probably better off going to full extension anyway. But the final thing I want to talk about in regards to this, tinfoil hat theory of mine, which some people have found quite hilarious because it's armor, right, has been the idea of resting position. So Kurt Holtzbetter, who I've shouted out to a lot of the time, he believes that one of the possible explanations for why Fiore wrote what he did is because it is perhaps linked to the idea of basically, not quite a combat manual, but along the same sort of idea. Not just the idea that I may be fighting in battle, but also the idea of fighting in an occupied zone, i.e. you are an occupying force, someone may try to jump you, right? Things happen, and you may use various weapons, as well as kind of the self-defense context, but more in a war sense. So a thing you might want to consider is what positions might you be standing in when you're not currently fighting? So for example, like right now, I'm in a basic at-rest position. If I suddenly need to get to attention, in theory, I'd like for me to be nice and trained and be able to go exactly where I need to go, but humans are not so perfect. Odds are, when I'm suddenly surprised to my right, I'm going to end up moving into a position more akin to this, because this is what we do when we're scared. And so being more comfortable with moving to a position like this does give me more options. So in the case of tutto porta di ferro tip up or dente d'ingegno, this could lead to you ending up in either way, just depending upon which side you could jump from. And another instance of that could be distraction, right? You know, all of a sudden I'm standing here, someone over there gets my attention, oh no, now there's someone rushing behind me, and now we end up in the better approach again. Another option could also be the idea of, you know, maybe something happened wherein someone rushed you with closer measure, right? You were holding someone back with your spear, they backed away, now you're here. And you, again, end up in a familiar position, or just a position you would move through, and suddenly need to deal with an incoming thrust. Now, do we know if that's true? No. We have no idea. But it is another application for what can look like relatively odd positions for the spear. You're not necessarily always going to be given time to settle into a guard. You should become comfortable with the idea of moving between these positions as part of how you naturally move. And also, you should become comfortable with jumping into them from a variety of places. Because guess what? Things happen when you fight, right? Sometimes your sword pings the wrong way. Sometimes your spear almost falls out of your hand. Sometimes you have to just rip it back and you end up with your wrong hand across it. Things happen. But either way, it all just boils down to a stick. And another important thing to consider is the idea of moving between these postos once you are actually engaged. So while we've shown a lot of the idea of, and then I take my posta, and he does his thrust, and I kill him because I've done the way of Fiore, and awesome. And that was a nice one, right? That's not necessarily always going to happen. You know, things to consider would be, I always am kind of skirting the line between, yes, I should try and stab Jake, and when he parries, I should be able to move to my next thing, but I don't necessarily want my next thing to always be the close range game, because that's all Fiore gives us, right? He says, I thrust, right? I get parried, whatever side, I should move to get with the still butt cap. In that case, I did it improvising, going the other way, but still, same idea. And this is great until people get used to it, especially if they're in armor, they'll become quite comfortable with it. So I should be comfortable with the idea of being able to move through different posta to maintain my range. So let's take that same example, right? I throw in the thrust initially, he parries it. I could swap over to a different posta. I could use a posta as a parry for a second before getting my point in there. The idea is just to make this more lively, just the way I do with my sword, and give myself options to fight out here, larga, rather than forcing myself to thrust or stretta. Which, I mean, that's a pretty metal title, but not necessarily a great way to fight, especially when people are bigger than you. But, either way, these are just some options that I want you to consider when it comes to looking at these spears. Don't think of it as just, this is what you do, this is all you do, because Fiore is not that kind of man, right? He's always telling us to slightly improvise here and there, or things can be done, just one-off sentences. You should consider it everything you've learned up until this point with the spear as being the same as with the sword, the axe, the dagger, and also be aware that if you're going to move to close range, especially in armor, you've got to be committed to a longer fight. When if you could stay at range, you might be a little better off and be able to do more. And sometimes as well, it can be in your best interest as just a training to force yourself to stay at longer range and use this to as much as it can be, so that when you need it, it can do more for you. But either way, thank you very much, Jake. Thank you all very much for sticking with us. So this will be coming out in conjunction with the sword versus spear using Fiore's method video, which is going to be quite a lot of fun. You can see me being all clanky. But otherwise, that shall bring this series to a conclusion. So, thank you very, very much for watching. We'll go over some other techniques another time.